Good evening. I am Bill Hall, a board member of Alaska Common Ground. It is my privilege on behalf of our board, all of whom are volunteers, to host tonight's discussion on Alaska's fiscal problems and solutions. We hope it will give you a better understanding of this complex issue. We hope it will motivate you to join us in finding the common ground on which our democracy depends. We could not conduct the work we do without the support of people like you. If you are a member, thank you. If you are not a member, please join us. In this time of COVID, we have been unable to gather together in groups to listen, share, and contribute the donations Alaska Common Ground collects in lieu of admission fees. So please go to our website, alaskacommonground.org, and click on the red donate option on the right side of the page and give what you can. Our first speaker, Cliff Groh. Cliff has studied Alaska's fiscal policy for over 4 decades. While serving on the staff of the Alaska State Legislature and as special assistant to the Commissioner of Revenue, he worked on issues involving taxes, the permanent fund, and the permanent fund dividend. Cliff was the legislative assistant who worked the most to develop and secure passage in 1982 of the legislation creating the permanent fund dividend. He was an invited participant to the Walker-Malott administration's forum on Alaska's future in 2015. He created and taught a course at the University of Alaska entitled Navigating Alaska's Fiscal and Economic Challenges. He authored or co-authored 4 chapters in academic books about the permanent fund dividend and Alaska fiscal policy. In 2020, he published 3 booklets on Alaska's fiscal crisis and options for its solution. These are available for free download at www.cliffgroh.org. Cliff has been a moderator, panelist, presenter, and organizer of more than a dozen events on Alaska's fiscal policy put on by Alaska Common Ground. Cliff, are you ready?
I am, sir, and thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the structural deficit and the options. And I speak tonight as analyst Cliff Groh, not advocate Cliff Groh. I left my opinions in the next room. So we're going to go through this slideshow about Alaska's structural deficit and the options to address it. The first thing to understand is you have to understand some history first. Alaska is now in its 3rd fiscal system. Let's run through them. From 1949, back in territorial days, up to 1979, 20 years after statehood, Alaska had a heavy reliance on a personal income tax to finance Alaska's government operations. And then in 1980, in the first big flush of oil money, Alaska repealed that personal income tax and started a new fiscal system which focused and had 2 elements and almost exclusively relied on large annual oil revenues, large amounts of oil revenues arriving every year in the form of oil taxes and oil royalties. And the second one being the spending of savings outside the permanent fund, savings that came from surplus oil revenues. And then now we have a new system started in 2018 where the state of Alaska relies heavily on permanent fund earnings with oil revenues falling far behind. It's about a 3-to-1 ratio of permanent fund earnings to oil revenues in our budget now, using the most common definition of Alaska's budget, unrestricted general fund dollars, or UGF dollars. So you might say, hey, Cliff, what happened to the old oil-based system? Why did it go away? Well, it went away because of a triple whammy. 3 things hit Alaska very hard. Number 1, Alaska oil production has declined by more than 75% since the peak. You can see from this graphic. In the blue bars that show Alaska oil production. In the late 1980s, more than 2 million barrels a day of oil flowed through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Now we're just around 500,000. And you'll notice, looking ahead, to 2030, we're not projected to go up much above 500,000 barrels. I think the gold line shows world oil prices. You'll notice we're well below our previous highs, and critically, world oil prices are not going to go back to the previous highs, and are not projected to ever go to go up high enough again and stay high enough to compensate for the very much lower Alaska oil production. And finally, in 2013, the state of Alaska changed its oil tax system in a way that made our state's oil tax revenues much more sensitive and susceptible to dropping oil prices. So what's the result? Oil revenues have cratered. The state of Alaska's oil revenues have fallen by 77%, by about 3/4. Adjusted for inflation, and this is very important to understand, adjusted for inflation, oil revenues per Alaskan are lower than they were before the Trans-Alaska Pipeline opened up and the big oil money started to flow in. And so that's a critical thing to understand. I heard a lot of public testimony. I've heard all of it. And the legislature's comprehensive fiscal plan working group. One testifier said Alaska gets 95% of its revenues from oil. That's just not true. Oil revenues are way down and below the permanent fund earnings now. So let's talk about the oil revenues collapse, the state of Alaska's responses to the collapse. There have been three main responses to the collapse of oil revenues. Number one, the state has spent savings outside the permanent fund. More than $17 billion in the last 9 years. They're effectively gone now. Number two, the state has cut spending, cut expenditures, both in the conventional budget, the budget for roads, schools, teachers, and public safety, and also in the state has cut permanent fund dividends. And third, the state of Alaska created in 2018 a new system to allow the sustainable spending, for the first time, a sustainable spending of permanent fund earnings in the conventional budget to pay for those roads and schools and public safety, et cetera. This system is called percent of market value, or POMV for short. POMV now provides more than 60% of Alaska's revenues, and Alaska is an endowment state. The problem is the endowment is too small to support the spending without additional revenues. Result, we're in a deep hole. You can look at the sea of red ink. And I want to stress these figures are now consensus figures within the legislature. These are the figures just released as agreed upon estimates of projected future deficits by that that group I mentioned before, the legislature's comprehensive fiscal plan working group. And they've agreed on these very grim numbers going forward, as far as the eye can see. My friend Peter Dunlop-Scholl is a cartoonist. He drew a cartoon of, one image of what that's like. Here's another cartoon from Peter Dunlop-Scholl, the Groh flow. It's I gave him the concepts, and the numbers. He drew this 12 months ago, so it's the numbers are outdated, but the concepts and the flows are the same. We're going to go over it briefly. This shows the state of Alaska's fiscal system. The brown oil barrel in the upper left represents and is labeled oil revenue. The oil revenues from oil taxes and oil royalties go into the general fund, that large, the state's household account shown up at the top. And most of those revenue, or most of the oil revenues go into the general fund, and most of the general fund revenues are spent essentially, as public services, like I said, schools, roads, public safety, varies. And some of the oil revenue goes down pursuant to the 1976 constitutional amendment into the permanent fund principle, because the permanent fund was created, and that's shown as a safe, in the gray safe in the lower left-hand corner. It's shown as a safe because the permanent fund principle can only be spent by a vote of the people, whereas the general fund can be spent by a simple majority of the legislature. The permanent fund principle generates earnings or income. They go into the permanent fund earnings reserve account that's shown as the actual checkbook there in the lower middle. And the critical change that occurred in 2018 for the first time, and very importantly now, a large portion of the permanent fund earnings, on the order of $3 billion a year, go sustainably in a way to keep preserving the permanent fund for the future, into the general fund to be spent on public services and also on permanent fund dividends, the famous Alaska institution shown in the lower right. So that, as I said, is the Groh flow in terms of how it works now. I'm going to talk about the options now. I'm going to talk about the long run options. I'm going to talk about combinations of options, and I'm going to talk about short run options. In the long run, one option would be to spend or overdraw the permanent fund earnings and then the permanent fund principal, after you got a vote of the people to allow it, until all the money in the permanent fund is gone. Some observers have seen this as the default trajectory or the path of least resistance. And the current discussions now partly represent a recognition that maybe that's not the right path and an attempt to get off that default trajectory. Another option that's talked about in the legislature is to make additional cuts to the conventional budget and or permanent fund dividends, either through the annual legislative process, through the discretion of the legislature, or with a tighter spending limit. The Alaska Constitution already provides its spending limit. It's not generally been effective. Some discussion of creating a tighter spending limit, either in the statutes or another one in the Alaska Constitution. Another option is to take the POMV system and the limits that are in statutes set up by that system and which passed in law in 2018 and make it part of the Alaska Constitution, so-called constitutionalizing POMV as a spending limit on permanent fund earnings. And given how large permanent fund earnings loom in the budget now, that would effectively be an overall spending limit. Another option is to bring back broad-based taxes to Alaska. I say bring back because Alaska, as you've heard before, had an income tax for 3 decades, a personal income tax that provided a substantial portion of the state's money for the budget. Just to talk about bringing back a personal income tax to Alaska. There's been discussion of bringing a statewide sales to Alaska for the first time, a statewide sales tax to Alaska for the first time. Local governments have sales taxes. The state of Alaska has never had one. And there's some talk of maybe having an employment tax for education, a variant of the old school tax as a broad-based tax. There's also been discussion to raising oil taxes. Obviously, a ballot measure failed last year. There's some discussion of maybe raising oil taxes by a smaller amount than was provided for in that ballot measure. And there's also increasing talk of raising other taxes and fees, like perhaps raising the motor fuels tax or raising fees for permitting and licensing generally. Now let's talk about 2 final long-run options that would be surprise people, from outside the state that are more understood within the state. They would, as options to address a substantial deficit that is structural. One is to guarantee the dividend in the Constitution. Although I'm not generally talking about pros and cons, I guess I need to explain this enough to say that some people argue that Alaska's politics are so fractured, we need to take the dividend out of the yearly decisions by the legislature and put it in the Constitution so that the legislature can directly face the conflict between and the trade-offs between lower services, lower budgets, and on one hand, and higher revenues from higher taxes on the other. And in a related fashion, some people talk about dedicating a split or making an allocation in the Constitution of permanent fund earnings and the spending in the budget between the conventional budget and dividends in terms of allocating a split between how they would be allocated going forward in the Constitution. Then there's some combination approaches that are discussed. One is instituting new revenues in the form of taxes, plus a tighter spending limit. Another option is a combination approach that's been talked about a lot recently. The last few weeks, I've heard a lot about it, is tying higher dividends to new revenues on a phased-in approach, sometimes called stair-stepping, is a new term I've heard for that. So it would be another combination approach, possibly. Then finally, we have what I would call short-run devices or sweeteners or bridges. These are sort of more insidery terms that sort of like put a deal together 1 year that would make something more sustainable over time. And another term is something sort of forward as a concession. People have talked about maybe having a jumbo permanent fund dividend 1 year and in return for some other changes in the state's fiscal system in terms of taxes or spending that would make the system more sustainable. And then finally, people have also talked about overdrawing permanent fund earnings 1 year and avoid and do it as a bridge, perhaps, but and trying to find a way to do it for only 1 year to get through 1 year, and then as a bridge to a more sustainable fiscal system, perhaps. As you've heard, I'm Cliff Groh. I'm always available to communicate with Alaskans at cliff.groh@gmail.com about Alaska's structural deficit and the options. And I want to thank Quentin Bidwell, Teresa Philbrick, and Peter
About
Buckshall
1
for the
minute
assistance
left.
in preparing the graphic. Thank you. And I'm done. Back to you, Bill.
Wow, right on time. So thanks, Cliff. Our topic is complex. You provided important information for us to begin our discussion. And our second speaker is Alaska Senate President Peter Micciche. Senator Peter Micciche represents Senate District O on the Kenai Peninsula, which includes most of the Kenai from Micciche to Seward and all the communities in between. The senator has been actively involved in the community since 1982, serving on the Soldotna City Council and as the mayor of Soldotna from 2007 to 2013. Senator Micciche was elected to the state Senate in 2013. He is currently serving as a Senate president for the 32nd Legislature and serves on key committees including resources, education, transportation, labor and commerce, rules, legislative budget and audit, legislative council, and numerous financial subcommittees. Peter retired from the oil and gas industry after 35 years of service in 2018. He has been a commercial salmon fisherman for 30 years, as well as a small business owner on the Kenai since 1983. Senator, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. Sound check, everything okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Excellent. Thank you to Common Ground for putting this on tonight. I will tell you, this is one of those classic Zoom calls. I'm a commercial fisherman who's kind of just off the boat. So if you saw my bottom half, you'd know that I put on a dress shirt for the top half to hide what's down below. So thank you for putting this on tonight. I don't have a formal presentation. I thought we'd talk for a few minutes, then I'm really looking forward to the questions. And I'm working off a handheld here, so bear with me. Anyway, Cliff did a good job, I think, kind of bringing about the issues. One little disagreement on how far we're down from the high of revenues. Not a disagreement, we're clearly down from that level, but revenue should have never been considered the norm, that level of revenue. We budgeted permanently in capital and operating with temporary revenue. So being in the oil and gas industry for 35 years, that roller coaster is something we're very much used to. And legislatures sort of became used to that level of revenue and decided that spending would grow accordingly. Now, to the credit of the legislature, we reduced that spending from a high of 8 to about half of that for UGF spending. We've done a pretty good job. We've reduced where we can, but we are clearly finding ourselves for the third time in this situation where low oil prices have demonstrated that we do not have this wire yet. Young state, we are blessed in many ways. But I think a fiscal plan has been in need since some of the early ISO reports that outline the same problem, except the state was saved several times by a higher price of oil when we had a higher level of production. I agree with Cliff that the lower level of production makes us a lot more susceptible to oil price fluctuations and quickly can put us in this situation as it has since 2014. The problem we have in the state of Alaska is the division in the bodies, not only the House and Senate, but in different caucuses, and the way the caucuses are divided reflect a divided Alaska. And a lot of it is a reflection of how people feel about the permanent fund dividend. So I've talked about kind of an all-in plan for the last year and a half. The all-in plan is where everyone gives a little bit to try to get us to a sustainable level of not only state spending, but services, and the selection of who helps pay for those services. So The all-in I've been talking about is reductions where possible, a revised spending limit that sort of keeps us growing at about inflation. So Anchorage CPI, if you will. A revenue, my choice has been a sales tax because I believe that's something, if we are going to have revenue, that's the only thing that will pass the legislature. Amending oil taxes primarily to kill the per barrel credit, which brings in additional revenue, but eliminates a political difficulty on people understanding why the per barrel credit exists. Modernizing the PFT calculation. And essentially what that is, that outlines the all-in. What does that mean? Government gives, Alaskans give. And over time, because of the growth in the permanent fund dividend, which has become our primary source of revenue, you would be able to balance a sustainable budget. So the long term, even though the Callan numbers show the permanent fund growing at 6.5%, over time has been in higher than 8%, 8.9%, I think, since inception. If you can limit government by CPI, smoothed over 3 years, your permanent fund's going to grow faster than your spending is if your spending is controlled somewhere around inflation. So what's difficult is getting people to come to work, make the tough choices, and being ready to vote on some of these key issues. So the political reality is it takes 11 senators, 21 House members for a new statute and a governor's signature. Or of course, if you're going to for a constitutional amendment, 1427 in the people's vote. What's somewhat discouraging is that everything now seems to be based on a permanent fund dividend amount. And I will tell you that a significant number of the new folks that are spending, that are serving the legislature, and I heard several of them, they only listed 2 items on their platform. And that was a full PFD and no binding caucus. We don't have the depth that we once had for people serving in the legislature that understand Alaska business, the services Alaskans count on, kind of how the state functions. They often now don't have the background that they once did. And that's difficult when you're asking them to help make these tough decisions. So I'm going to cut it short. It's going to take a lot of courage to get something done. You're going to have to take a lot of dedication. They're going to have to understand the system that I'm sure the speaker is going to talk about, that Cliff just talked about. But those solutions, although they can be tweaked accordingly, you're looking at the available solutions that will kind of get us there and can be adjustable over time so that once they're in place, we can stop this annual battle about the size of the PFD and move on to more important things like the crime rate, sexual abuse, and substance abuse, and all of the other issues that we're looking at. And we'd like to improve in a state where we're number 50 of 50 in many of those situations. So I'd like to get back on improving the lives of Alaskans and move past this. I think most legislators feel the same way, and we're just hoping to see that kind of courage and moving to the next step. Sort of Alaska turning from an infant state to at least an adolescent. So I'm going to cut it short there and look forward to hearing from the speaker and then answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. A reminder for you participants, your questions are important. So please write them in Zoom's Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will collect them for submission to the panelists after all presentations are finished. If you see a question on the Q&A that you like, vote for it by clicking on the thumbs up icon. Our next and last speaker is Representative Louise Stutes, who is Speaker of the Alaska House of Representatives. Representative Louise Stutes represents House District 32, encompassing Kodiak, Seldovia, Cordova, and Yakutat. She has been actively involved in her community, serving on the Kodiak Borough Assembly from 2006 to 2012. She was first elected to the legislature in 2014 and has served 4 terms. She has served as the chair of the House Special Committee on Fisheries and as a member of the House Transportation Committee. She has also served as Majority Whip and is now Speaker of the House. Representative Stutes has owned a small business in Kodiak and has served on many business and community service organizations. Madam Speaker, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very kindly. And I want to thank you very much for the invite. It's really an honor to be here and a pleasure as well. I found it very interesting listening to Cliff Groh as well as our Senate President, and I can't disagree with much of what was said, if anything. The one thing I am so grateful to you is clearly public engagement is going to be critical to any good fiscal solution for Alaska. So this is really an important venue. I guess I don't have to say, most people can see that it's been a pretty contentious year this last year. However, I'm an optimist and I remain optimistic. And I think I'll probably take a little different road than the senator did. He was kind of gave the overall view, and I'll try and get a little more specific. I'm happy to say this is the first time that lawmakers have agreed that a blended solution is necessary in order to solve our fiscal crisis. But it appears that the disagreement comes as to what exactly that blend is going to be. Will it be a combination of taxes, cuts, a larger PFD, a more moderate PFD with no taxes, or somewhere in between? And how will we exactly get new revenues to fit in? There's a wide variety of revenues that have been discussed. There's an education revenue, as the good senator said. There's a sales tax. There's been an income tax that's been discussed. And so there's really nothing that's been focused on more than the other, although I have to agree somewhat. I think personally, I've heard a sales tax be brought up a little bit more often than any other. And so that's kind of what the legislature is trying to work on right now, with some immediate issues in front of us, such as the reverse sweep and this year's PFD. And before I really go and discuss too much of the solutions, I would like to reflect briefly on the last few months and talk about really what Alaskans are facing here. The reverse sweep and the SBR, which is the budget reserve, my mind is failing me right now. The statutory budget reserve transfer is necessary in order to fund the $1,100 PFD. That's what we needed. But we needed a 2/3 vote, a 3/4 vote, excuse me, in order to do that, which we failed. The House majority voted unanimously, but we did not have the support of the House minority because of certain issues that they were concerned about. That reduced the PFD down to $500. It defunded power cost equalization and the performance scholarship, as many other things, other programs as well. Then our governor said $500. Well, that doesn't work for me. So he vetoed the remainder of it, along with about $2 million in projects. So that's kind of where we are right now. It's pretty well understood, I believe, that the legislature and the legislators recognize that the PFD is pretty doggone important to Alaskans. But we need to have a PFD that doesn't bankrupt the state. We have services that people expect to have, whether it be education, public safety, transportation. We all have to kind of share in it. And as I've said many a time, you just can't have it all. You can't have all the services and a big check too. So that's one of the big issues that is being discussed now. As I said earlier, do you want a smaller PFD and maintain your services? It's pretty clear we can't cut our way to a balanced budget. That would be just about cutting $1 billion in our budget, and that just doesn't work. So an equitable solution must balance the diverse needs of all of Alaskans and not unfairly burden one sector over another, and yet at the same time look into the future. So it has to pencil out. And the governor, as I'm sure many people are aware of, has put out his 50-50 plan. But the problem is that leaves $1 billion deficit in our budget. And thus far, I'm not aware of how the governor intends to fill that $1 billion budget, which I would look forward to hearing his proposals on that. So we're kind of relying on hoping that our working group is looking at all of these options and going to bring forward some kind of ideas or maybe a potential menu of solutions that we could look at and come to agree on. Our opinion as the House majority is everything has to be on the table. Everything has to be on the table so we can all talk about it and come up with common threads that is a win-win, where the legislature can agree and we agree that it's for the betterment of all Alaskans. And then I would like to say, I always get asked, as far as what Alaskans can do, what can we do? And I would say what Alaskans can do is stay informed. Be in contact with your legislators, both in the House and in the Senate, as well as all legislators. If they have a differing opinion than you have, tell them what you think and why you think. But, the one thing I will say is be respectful in doing so. It's really kind of disheartening to see some of the emails you get. They may have a good idea, but they're so disrespectful in how they present it that it just goes against them. Tell us what's important to you and what your vision is. You can call, you can write, you can email, but hold your legislators accountable. So with that, I will kind of sum up and say again, thank you. And I look forward to answering any questions anyone might have.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Our speakers have spoken, and it is now time for them to answer the questions you have submitted. If there are more than can be answered by 8 p.m., they have agreed to extend their time to 8:15. If you think of more questions, you can still submit them in the Q&A. And please remember, you can help Cliff identify those questions you consider most important by using the thumbs up icon at the bottom of your screen. So with that, Cliff, are you ready to start the Q&A?
I sure am, Bill, and we'll go right ahead. The most popular question is one that I have been asked a lot over the years. And now let either the president or the speaker take it first, whichever one feels like it. Could you compare and contrast Norway's system in terms of the numbers, how Norway invested its oil revenues, and current endowments about both Norway? And the questioner, Kat Haber, said they have more than a $1 trillion fund, and it generates some cash flow for dividends and interest payments. And Alaska has a substantially smaller permanent fund. Could either the speaker or the president address, compare and contrast Norway's use of oil revenues to the state of Alaska?
Well, I'll just
Uh,
chime in since I
um,
don't, do I
Go
hear
ahead,
this?
Madam Speaker, go
Then-
ahead.
Thank you. I'll just chime in to say, to start with, Norway and is all state owned. So that's a big difference right there. They don't send out checks to their people, every citizen every year. They maintain those funds and they use them to educate their public or their individuals and their citizens and pay for their medical and that type of thing, but they don't send out individual checks. That's one big difference.
Does Norway, maybe Senate President Micciche wants to address this, does Norway also have substantially higher taxes than Alaska, which Alaska is the only state in the country which has no broad-based tax of any kind?
So there's a few differences. My daughter brought me a beer, which is very sweet, except I don't have an opener, honey. So there's I'm glad you appreciated that, Madam Speaker. So there are several differences. First of all, they've had a lot higher level of production. They have a lot greater percentage that goes to the state. As the speaker said, it's state owned, and they haven't paid any out. But let's think about how different ours would have been. So we've paid out close to 30 billion in permanent fund dividends. So think about that 30 billion, even taking into account all those differences. And we're just a state, they're an entire country, but think about what that 30 billion over time would have been with the exponential growth from 8.9% over 40 years. So we probably would have, let's see, close to 200 million right now for just a state. And aside from the fact that you talked about the fact is that their basic tax rate, in fact, my brother-in-law and I were just talking, they're from the Netherlands, and they talked about their tax rate today. Their tax rate is significantly higher than the US. So they're using most of the taxes for basic services. Alaska has no taxes, and we've used our revenues, but the payout has substantially hindered. Of course, that's what our founding fathers decided, that the permanent fund was a good idea, and thank God that they decided to invest in a permanent fund. But we'd probably be in the 200 range if it wasn't for what we paid out in permanent fund dividends. The other thing that the state of Alaska did, I mean, it's actually grown pretty substantially over time. If you think about it, is the legislature has reinvested their half. So a lot of people say, wait a minute, you guys, we get this little 25%, but you are now keeping part of it. The reality of it is the legislature has reinvested their half back into the permanent fund, which has caused it to grow substantially higher. And they've contributed about 8 billion on top of that, which has grown along with the fund in excess revenues. So the way my friend Lyman Hoffman, when I give them a hard time about the spending they did, we didn't go on a spending spree, we went on a saving spree back then. And he has a very good point, that 8 billion has grown substantially. So over half the value of the permanent fund is from what was reinvested by the legislature. And that's something substantial to share with folks. I'm also a pro PFD guy, but we should all be talking about real numbers. And a lot of people are unaware of that. In fact, I spoke to a legislator 2 weeks ago and talked about the fund being that much higher because of that. And he was unaware of that split.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. The next question is by also just as popular as the other question from the people around the state is, and it's for both the House Speaker and the Senate President. And we'll start with you, Speaker Stutes. Is the lack of involvement by the governor a crippling blow to any attempt to deal with the permanent fund dividend, taxes, and state services? And this is a two-part question. The other part of the question is, what do you think will happen in the special session scheduled to start on Monday, August 16th? Speaker Stutes?
Well, it's always easier when you have a participatory executive branch of government. it just makes it easier. The governor did participate more this year than he did in the first 2 years. And we certainly appreciated that because it opened a dialogue and it allowed us to know what exactly he was hoping for. Whether or not we agreed or disagreed, we at least were able to have conversations. And so I would say it was somewhat crippling the first couple years of his governorship, but he was a new governor, and you learn things and you just kind of try and take it as you can. Insofar as what's going to happen in this special session, I don't think that that's been determined yet. I think that we have a working group that we are somewhat relying on as a common thread to come together insofar as a solid fiscal plan. That's what we're hoping for. I noticed today that the House minority put out, several of their members mentioned how important the items that are covered by the reverse sweep are and how critical they are to Alaskans. So I'm very hopeful that we'll be working together to address the reverse sweep, to at least take those items off the table at some point. But it's going to take some work between all of the legislators, because that is not on the governor's call. There is nothing on the governor's call that would allow us to address that currently. So I really don't have an answer as to what's going to happen when we meet in joint session just yet.
Thank you. Mr. President, could you address both parts of that question? The part about with the question you're asking about the governor's crippling lack of involvement, and number two, what you predict will happen in the special session scheduled to start on Monday, August 16th.
So saying a crippling lack of involvement sort of telegraphs how the person asking the question feels about it. But I think it's a great question. It was difficult, including this year. I would like for the governor to be in Juneau more. I think he's trying. To sort of understand. He's working a lot more with the speaker and he's working a lot more with both leadership teams. I think the tough part, and this is a common problem for many governors, they don't get to tell us what's going to happen. They have an agenda, and if they work well with us constructively, part of their agenda will be satisfied. But there's a reason for a 3 branches to government. And I think governors really need to realize that, especially governors that have served in the legislature. They can present ideas and we can work with them for the ideas that we can support, but we're not going to support all of them. And you can't just keep beating legislators over the head until they agree with you. You have to work together on attainable, politically possible solutions. Politically possible means that whole 1121 and the governor's signature thing, or 1427 and the people's support. You can't just by sheer will make the legislature do things. We come from different districts. We have different politics. So we have to work better together. That's always best when we spend a lot of time together. So I'm seeing an improvement. I like Mike. The governor's a good guy. But we need to work better together, continue working better together as we've seen over the last couple months. Special session, I agree with the speaker. I think Alaskans are waiting. I think Alaskans are suffering. There are many things that are left undone. We don't have a PFD right now in the cards. It's been vetoed. It was not on the call. We have WWAMI and PCE and many other things that are a part of the reverse sweep that are not included in the budget so far. We have some projects that have been stricken from the books because of those vetoes. We have a lot of work to do together. I'd like to see the call revised so that we can pull a deal together, kind of a grand deal on moving forward and getting the work done for the people. But whenever we have Alaskans suffering because of the internal politics of the legislature and the governor, we are not getting our job done. And we need to work together to make sure that those items are completed. or there are going to be a lot of people that will not be able to afford their power bills. There'll be college students that will be making other plans to move away from state universities because of the issues with the reverse sweep. And we don't have a funded government without CBR or SBR vote. So we have a lot of work to do. I hope we can do that together. I'm certainly hopeful. And I know that the speaker is as well. We've talked about it a lot. We'll see what legislators are willing to do when they get there, if they're willing to get their work done and work better together in order to do so.
Thank you very much, Ms. President. So we're going to start with you this time, and this is a question, another very high rank question, and it goes like this, and it's for both of you. Please help me understand the preference for a sales tax over an income tax. This person asks, to me, an income tax would bring in revenues from people who work in the state but live out of the state and could be designed to minimize impact on low-income individuals and families. In contrast, the sales tax would negatively impact remote communities where taxable goods cost a lot more than they do in the road system. And the speaker says this hardly seems fair, the questioner. Mr. Senate President, and then Speaker Stutes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to start with that. So there's the 11 and 21 thing, folks. I've counted the votes, and you're not going to pass an income tax in the Senate. But there's reasons for that. There are reasons for that. And I can tell you my reasons for that. Both will pay, out-of-state people will pay both taxes, an income tax and a sales tax. In my community, we moved from a heavily property taxed community to a sales tax community. We essentially make a living off of dip netting. That's just the reality. We have so many millions coming in the summer season. People from Anchorage, people from out of state that are up here fishing and hunting and things like that. We were able to cut our property taxes while I was mayor 3 times with revenue largely from people from somewhere else. So it works both ways. But when I talk about the all-in plan, what does that guarantee? It guarantees Medicaid, the way it's currently structured for lower income Alaskans. It guarantees that the other services they count on will continue to be available. If you look at the balance, the reason that many people do not support an income tax is because you are shifting the income of some to the lack of income for others. And we believe that a sales tax can be structured to not unfairly impact low income Alaskans. So we can talk about exemptions that would make it easier for them to manage. But what it would, in an all-in, it's also going to be funding a larger PFD that can help offset some of that differential in income as well. So nothing's perfect. You got to think about what you can get passed. And I think you can get a fair sales tax passed. I know it's regressive by some standards, but I think it can be structured so it's less regressive. And without a source of revenue that can pass, none of this works.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Madam Speaker, in terms of this question of income tax versus sales tax, and in terms of also this questioner asked about the impacts on non-residents, low-income individuals and families, and on remote communities in the bush. Madam Speaker?
Thank you very much for the question. And I think that the Senate President's correct. A lot of it is numbers in the legislature, and he clearly has a pulse on the Senate, but I don't know that the House does support a sales tax over an income tax. There's a lot of conversation about this. An income tax, or excuse me, a sales tax is very difficult. I'll take myself for an example. Every one of my communities, every one of my rural communities currently has a sales tax, anywhere from 6 to 9%. Well, when you add another sales tax on that, that gets to be pretty onerous. And I think that, as the good senator mentioned, there would have to be exemptions. And so then you say, well, once you put on all these exemptions, are you really collecting enough to make a difference? Because for myself, I would not support at this point in time a sales tax unless you exempted food, housing, home heating oil, and medicines. I mean, those are the things that really are necessities. So I think that there's a lot of conversation going on, and there's a lot of conversation going on that says, do we want to tax people? Do people want to pay a tax, whether it be an income tax or a sales tax, so we can have a larger PFD? As I said earlier, this year we started out and we had an $1,100 PFD with a balanced budget without overdrawing the earnings reserve account. So that's what it boils down to. And there's a lot of conversation that's got to be had before I think you'll see a tax implemented.
Okay, well, that actually in part helps us segue, Speaker Stutes, and I'll go with you in this next one. The next most highly rated question, very highly rated, is about the dividend and about means testing, although it doesn't use a term. And the question reads from the questioner: for those who advocate for the importance of the permanent fund dividend to assist those in need, why not meet those needs in the traditional way, in the form of policy decisions and programs that benefit lower income families? This speaker said, this questioner says, the permanent fund dividend has turned our state into a greedy grab with little attention to basic needs like education and public safety. Speaker Stutes, why don't you take a crack at that before we go to the president?
Well, that's a tough one. Unfortunately, the permanent fund has become an entitlement. And I find it very interesting because a good portion, not all, but a good portion of the people that I get emails from, or I'm hearing from, that are saying, give me my full PFD, I want it, and I want it now, they've lived here in Alaska 10 years or less. So that's a difficult one. I've heard people say too, why not set it up so the people in need actually get the funds? Well, you can't do that because that's not constitutional. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. That's a good thought. There's a lot of good ideas out there, and if we could somehow implement something like that, I just don't see the public as a whole, based on what I've seen in the last 7 years, buying into a program like that.
Senate President Micciche, what about you? What do you think about that question about addressing the needs of changing the dividend, making it more means tested, and having it have the state of Alaska use money to benefit lower income families? Could you address that question?
Certainly. What's interesting about that question is it seems so. The PFDI folks I hear from are from a couple of different perspectives. One are from Alaskans that don't believe any part of the permanent fund dividend segment of the permanent fund belongs to the government. It's not ours at all. It's theirs, and they want their full share of it. They gave up their subsurface rights for that amount of funding that's supposed to come every year. In fact, I have a renter. I own a couple apartments, and I have a renter in a duplex that talks to me all the time about his subsurface rights. You can chuckle about that if you'd like to. He rents for me and doesn't own any property, but so I don't ever look down on people that feel that way. That's how they feel, and that's fine. So they don't believe in means testing. That's their money, whether they make $500,000 a year or they make $10,000 a year. That is their share of Alaska's oil wealth. And there are a lot of sort of urban legends in the whole thing about what the founding fathers thought about it, why it's there. So that's one group. Then there's another group that doesn't care about the permanent fund dividend at all. I think we're operating kind of blindly. We've all kind of tried to do some polling to understand what do Alaskans want? What do they think is fair? Do they want to be taxed to pay for partially government, partially a higher PFD, or do they want us to reduce the PFD? What do they want us to do in order for it to balance? But I think means testing would make sense, where above a certain level of income, your PFD is either reduced or eliminated. I was a relatively high income individual during my entire working life, and I would have been willing to do that to give a larger PFD to lower income folks, still get a little bit of a PFD, just so I can kind of share in the wealth a little bit as well. But those two schools of thought, there may be as many people that feel that that's appropriate, but I will tell you, the folks you hear from are violently opposed. The folks you hear from most often are violently opposed to that kind of approach. They want their cut. They gave up their subsurface rights, and by golly, they want their full PFD. So it would be nice to understand what that looks like on a statewide basis, and whether or not we can actually put an advisory vote out there and learn what people feel. If you have a $500 to $1,000 PFD, there wouldn't be any taxes. If you have a $1,500 PFD, you're going to need $500 million. If you're talking about a 50-50, you're going to need $800 million to $1 billion in new taxes. And if you're going to want a full PFD, the traditional statutory, you're going to need 1.5 to 2 billion in taxes. What is your choice? What's your vision? It'd be nice to get a really accurate measure of that, because we all want to serve our constituents well, but we're operating somewhat blindly.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're going to change the pace a little bit. And this is another highly rated question. Could someone address, and I'd like both of you to address it, the question of how the massive increase in the cost of providing health insurance has affected the budget? So the question is, how is the massive increase in the cost of providing health insurance affected the budget? We'll start with you, Mr. President. What is your view on the effects of the increase in the cost of providing health insurance affected the budget?
Oh, there's no question about it. It's our largest spend right now. There's no doubt about it. It's been a substantial impact. And until we get control of healthcare costs and decide how we're going to deliver it in this state, not only for Medicaid recipients, but for retirees. I mean, we know that we have a significantly unfunded mandate, which they happen to be nearly 100% funded right now because of the earnings from the Arm Board in the last year. But that will continue to be an issue. It's a big piece, and we need solutions both statewide and nationally on how we're going to afford and reduce. So when I talked earlier about the all-in plan, and we talked about only increasing by Anchorage CPI, that requires that we get some control about the annual increase to the cost of healthcare. It's a significant difference, and we need to be open about those issues and try to find some statutory fixes. Some of those statutory fixes could include some changes that limit what can be charged, and sort of a lower 48 cost plus thing for Alaska. The profitability is kind of out of this world, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but we need to get to the bottom of it. But it's one of those things that we really can't get to the root of, because every year we're fighting about the same thing and unable to improve the really big cost indicators that we've been unable to touch because we simply haven't had the time. We're sitting down there fighting over a PFD until July.
Okay, thank you. Speaker Stutes, what do you think about the question of how what the question calls the massive increase in the cost of health insurance has affected the budget?
Well, I can't disagree with anything that the senator has said, and I would agree with everything he said. And I will just add to it by saying, just to keep our HES budget flat, it cost us $70 million a year. So then you add to it, that's just HES, and then you add to it all of the contracts that the state has with different unions. It's very impactful to our budget.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to go with another question we haven't had as much about. Talk about POMV. We're going to start with you, Speaker Stutes. And the question is about what's the effect of overdrawing from the permanent fund, from using the permanent fund earnings. If you could explain, how the POMV system works, and in particular, what are the effects of overdraws? And there's a couple questions like this, and one was, if we deviate from the 5% POMV draw with ad hoc draws, are you concerned that we will zero out the permanent fund earnings reserve account the same way we spent down the 2 budget reserves? Could you talk about that and about how POMV works and about the risks of overspending or overdrawing?
I will try and enlighten you. It's taken me about 6 good solid years to get my arms around this and understand it. The POMV is the percent of market value. And so it's a percentage, excuse me, of the revenues earned by the permanent fund. And so according to, excuse me, the Permanent Fund Corporation, a sustainable draw is about 4.5% to 5%, which means 4.5% to 5% of the draw. And when you take these dollars, there is a proposal to take 50% of those dollars and apply it to a permanent fund, and 50% of those dollars to apply it to the essentially running the state. And in doing that, that leaves $1 billion hole. Well, so then you can either change the formula and make it, 80-20 or whatever it might be, that makes it balance out so we can pay our bills and then take the leftover, and I say leftover, the balance, to pay the permanent fund. If we continually to overdraw that, yes, you're looking down the road at no permanent fund dividend, because the money simply won't be there to provide a permanent fund dividend. I don't know how clear I am on that. For every $1 billion we take out of the earnings reserve is $50 million less each year for state services. So I don't know if I'm very clear on that, and maybe Senator Micciche can add to it to make it to clarify it a bit more if need be.
Senator, could you address that question about the effects of overspending or spending more than the 5% draw that is allowed in state statutes under the POMV law, and using ad hoc draws that exceed that 5%, and what effect that would have on the permanent fund earnings reserve account and the state's future ability to spend?
Certainly. So when you look at typical endowments, like the permanent, they're all usually in that 4.75% to 5%. We didn't kind of pull it out of a hat. We studied it, looked at, the Callan numbers and their projections for the future. Why is that important? Because we think that's the healthiest proportion that you could remove annually and still have the fund grow at a healthy rate. So think about the Callan numbers are 6.5%. If you're pulling out 5%, you're only growing at 1.5. And we know over time, the fund has grown at a much higher number, and I hope that continues to happen. But it protects you from those down years. And if you overspend today, you're essentially stealing from your grandkids, right? You're reducing the amount that fund can grow. That fund will one day allow our state to be sustainable, likely without taxes, with a healthy level of spending. So it's imperative, and the speaker talked about that $50 million. So if you think about 6.5% for growth, if you took 6.5 out, then that's $65 million a year, but it compounds over time. So a good way to think about that is what I said earlier on how quickly the fund has grown and why Norway's has grown so much quicker. They are drawing at a healthy rate, but the difference in what they put in and the exponential growth over time, compounded, of course, has grown significantly quicker. Ours would as well. So 5% is a good rate. Some want to actually go lower. I actually don't think we draw enough if we go lower. Some dream about the day that we have 100 million in the permanent fund, which is kind of a sustainable number to take care of all state expenses, especially if we continue to have smaller pots of revenue like fuel taxes and things like that. But the biggest reason is the permanent fund is supposed to be permanent. It is there to provide for future generations. And anything you withdraw above growth is stealing from your kids and grandkids. And that truly was the vision of the permanent fund and the reason why it's so important that we observe that today, in my view.
Right. We may have time for one or two more questions, and and thank you very much, Senator. So we're going to start with you again. And this is a question, and there's a number of questions that are like this, which suggests that the state's budget is still too large. And that's been a theme of some, as you know, some of the public testimony in front of the fiscal plan working group. This particular question said, if the state of Alaska made or established an income tax, a sales tax, or another tax, what percentage range is suggested to make up for the state's excessive over expenditure or excessive spending? So, Senator, we'll start with you and then go to Madam Speaker. Senator?
Yeah, so theoretically, there's always that concern that if you provide a spigot of money that comes from the people, that government will continue to open the spigot until there's nothing left to wring out of the turnip, right? There's no doubt that we can make some reductions over time, which is kind of what the spending limit does. If you remember, the governor a couple of years ago tried a 30% reduction, which was simply unmanageable, right? If you have a spending limit that's somewhere around a smooth 3 to 5 year CPI, it actually allows you over time to manage, slowly bring in the cost down of government. It allows you to make some good decisions, to make some decisions about what you can or cannot afford for services. It allows constitutionally required services to be managed more efficiently, but you don't hit them all in 1 year. It gives time to manage that more effectively. It kind of works. So I think there is room for reductions. If I were going to support a sales tax or any kind of revenue, I would like for it to have a sunset. Because again, when I talk about the all-in, just the math of the permanent fund over time brings you out of this in a certain amount of time. I can't tell you how many years it'll take because I don't know the rate of return. I don't know how much we'll be able to reduce expenditures. I don't know what demands are going to be on the government in the future. So I can't say how many years, but theoretically and in practice and other endowments over time, the growth of the permanent fund will be higher than the amount that you're spending, and over time it would be okay. So I'd like to see a sunset. I would not like to leave a spigot that can be controlled by the legislature over time when they decide they're going to spend more than the people support. So if we did pass a revenue measure like a sales tax, or say an income tax passes the legislature and is signed by the governor, I'd like to see a sunset. That tells the government that you're not getting this source of revenue forever, that you still need to do things efficiently. Then if you still need that source of revenue after 5 years or 7 years, that you can renew that statute and continue that spigot, if you will. But I like having that spotlight on the sunset that says this may be more than you need. Adjust accordingly over time.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Speaker, what do you say, and just read the question again, if the state made or established an income tax, sales tax, or another tax, what percentage range is suggested to make up for the state's over expenditure? So if you could address that, and I think that'll be we'll only have one small question after that. Speaker Stutes?
Well, I would agree with Senator Micciche. I think that a sunset on any kind of new revenue would be important. And I think it's would be a lot more comforting to Alaskans. But when I hear the state's overspending, or I hear people say, let's cut. We've cut what, $3 billion in the last 6 years from our budget. It might even have been a little more than that, but there is clearly areas where the budget can be trimmed. But I think, as the good senator mentioned, it's something that's got to be assessed and evaluated and carefully tuned to those reductions. And even if you look at the governor's budget that he proposed this year, prior to his vetoes, his own budget was pretty close to being flat. There just, it wasn't a lot of big reductions that were available. I think that once we get over this TFD issue, we will have the ability to look a little more in depth into fine tuning the reductions in our budget. But I truly do agree with Senator Micciche insofar as the importance of a sunset on any kind of revenue.
Well, thank you very much. We've reached now, I perceive, to the end of our time, unless our moderator, Bill Hall, wants to add anything. Bill, would you, and I want to thank very much Speaker Stutes and President Micciche. Bill?
Well, thank you, Chuck.
I'm Cliff.
Cliff, we have a Chuck that's been doing a lot of work on this, so I get
Chuck
it.
Gilbert has done a lot of work.
Yes, we thank you all for joining us this evening, and especially our presenters for taking extra time to be with us. Democracy has never been so important. It can only work when citizens like you engage with each other to reaffirm the values on which our nation was founded. It can only work when the power of what unites us is greater than the power that divides us. We are encouraged that so many Alaskans attended this forum. It is an affirmation that you value what we do. If you are a member of Alaska Common Ground, we thank you. If not, we hope you will support us by becoming one or making a donation or both. It is easy. Go to our website, alaskacommonground.org, and click on the red donate option on the right side of the page. That wraps it up for this evening. We thank you all for coming.